Good evening. It is now 6:30, and I will call the Monday, June 12th, 2017 Burnsville Planning Commission to order. Our first item this evening is the adoption of tonight's agenda. Commissioners, do you have any changes or additions to the agenda?
No, sir. No changes.
None from commissioners, staff?
No.
With no changes, commissioners, I would stand for a motion.
So moved.
Moved by Commissioner Workman.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Singh. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. That brings us to our second item on the agenda this evening, which is the adoption of the minutes from the May 22nd meeting. Commissioners, do you have any changes to the published minutes?
Nope. No changes.
Staff?
No changes.
No changes? Brian?
Nope.
Okay. With no changes, I would stand for a motion.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Moved by Commissioner Singh.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Workman. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. That brings us to our third item this evening, which is a public hearing, Valley Natural Foods PUD amendment for an 8,048 square foot building expansion and transient merchant food trucks, CUP amendment to allow impervious surface to exceed 30% in the Shoreland District. It is a preliminary and final plat of a one-lot commercial subdivision known as Doble Third Edition, located at 13750 County Road 11. And presenting this evening is Ms. Garros. Ms. Garros, you have the floor.
Thank you. The application before you is for Valley Natural Foods. They've been a longstanding co-op in Burnsville, and you have reviewed this. The Planning Commission has reviewed an application in the past for the expansion of this, most recently in 2007. At this point, what has occurred is Valley Natural Foods has purchased the adjacent lot to the west, in which there is a car wash that's no longer operational. The proposal is to combine the two existing properties into one lot. That is the proposed preliminary and final plat. And then in addition to that, they would like to add on to the existing building, primarily to the west, which will go into that adjacent lot, if you will, and then also make some minor changes to the overall site plan. There's a small part of the addition that will occur on the northern part of the site, basically in the area, I can get this, a small addition, about 800 or so square feet up in this area as well, but the majority will be the addition on the west side. In the planning report, we did provide a lot of background information on the previous planned unit developments that affect this site and the other properties within the area. I don't plan on going through all of those, but really just wanted to provide that for background information for Planning Commission. On this map, we see that the Doble Addition project is this area in green. And at one point in time, all of this area was under one ownership, that of the electric company. And there have been several subdivisions and PUDs that apply to all of these properties. What we are looking at is the Valley Natural Foods site, which is the very easterly part of this development. And again, the most recent PUD for Valley Natural Foods was 2007. The proposal is, actually I need to correct this for you. The proposal includes 8,924 square feet, and that includes both the westerly addition and then that little northerly piece that's proposed to be added. And as far as the PUD benefits, we have a situation where an existing business is going to continue to expand and stay in the community. It's a very popular business, and that is definitely a benefit and a value to increase the local tax base. The car wash site has been vacant for some time now. It's in a deteriorated state, so by purchasing this piece to add on and take out the existing facilities, we see that as a benefit in terms of the overall improving the appearance, the property values, and then also reducing noise by taking out the vacuum cleaners. The redevelopment expands a retail store, providing expanded array of goods and services to the neighborhood and to the city. Site design is sensitive to the adjacent residential on the east and to the south by following previously approved PUD standards related to lighting, signage, and traffic circulation, hours of operation, etc. The proposed PUD maintains the shared access and shared parking and maintenance requirements of previous PUDs with not only the subject site, but the adjacent parcels to the west, and then also a joint access and maintenance agreement with the property to the north. This is an opportunity for a private redevelopment. It eliminates a marginal commercial use in favor of expanding a neighborhood-oriented business, and will help to bring additional vitality to the development and to the area. The proposed impervious surface, which we'll get into in a little bit, is 67%, which is less than that allowed by ordinance, which would be up to 75%. Site accessibility will be improved to Valley Natural Foods and the retail properties to the north. And the change of location and direction of the drive-through out there will also be an improvement, because instead of having lights facing directly south toward a residential neighborhood, the orientation will change so that car lights will be facing to the east. In terms of the deviations that are being requested, there are a couple. They're looking again for reduced parking, which is a PUD deviation that has been approved in the past for the project. They're looking for a driveway access that I'll point out in a minute that exceeds a 24-foot standard. They're looking for a 55-foot access, and this is something that's been reviewed by the city engineer, and we'll discuss this further. Also, they're looking for a deviation for the trash and recycling. And they're requesting some flexibility with regard to that. I'll show a plan that we just received that addresses this item. They're looking for some flexibility with the landscape requirements. This was approved with their last PUD, and basically they do have the required amount of building perimeter landscaping. It's just not to the depth of 6 feet, which is a current standard. The last flexibility is there is a requirement in the ordinance for providing pedestrian access, and the applicant has been working with staff, and we do have a plan that shows potential to provide access to the site from County Road 11. For the project itself, it's a fairly straightforward application. There's a lot of stuff on this plan, and if there's one thing that we can reiterate for the Planning Commission and public, is this site is encumbered by a lot of different existing easements. So it's not as if you have a nice blank slate to work with out there. There are a lot of easements and utilities that need to be worked with, primarily affecting the site on the south side and then to the east. What the applicant is proposing to do is to, just going to move ahead for a moment. They're proposing to basically remove all of the improvements to the west that are on the car lot site so that they can do their building expansion. And what this graphic shows is the demolition plan that's proposed for the project. In addition to that, on the upper right-hand part of the project, they're proposing to make a change to realign this access to provide better transition for vehicles as they're coming off County Road 11. This access is a right-in, right-out only access. The project includes, again, basically expanding the building in this location. The primary expansion will be for added bakery space, added space for their operations. There will be some additional retail space added. This is a small 800 square foot area up in through here. But primarily, it's basically to expand their areas where they do their food production and also have some of their meats, produce, etc., back in this location. One of the items that is being changed is this is the new access that's proposed. This is that 55-foot wide access. This would be the driveway to the city maintenance facility. It is actually a private driveway on the city's property. What they're proposing to do is to relocate the loading areas to the new expansion on the north side. So what would happen is vehicles would come in through here and then drive through, back in, and then exit out back to Frontier Drive. The current location for the current loading area is a door that is located actually facing to the east on the front side, if you will, of the building. And we'll look at that in a moment, but this should be a much better situation. It will allow for larger trucks to access the site more in tune with the grocery needs. And also, they will be utilizing the city driveway to be able to access the property. In addition to that, they are adding some more parking in this part of the project site. And they are relocating and modifying the drive-through to the building. The drive-through is proposed down in this location, basically with vehicles coming in, entering here. There will be a window here for a coffee and juice bar, and then vehicles will exit back out. Oops, sorry about that. Exit back out and then out of the development. The current project has their building, and they've got a drive-through that vehicles drive facing toward the south, and there's a pickup window on the west side of the building. So that's what I mean by it will be relocated. So instead of having vehicles facing with headlights directed to the south, they will be directed more in an east-west orientation. The final plat is a matter of just combining the two parcels into one lot. The existing drainage and utility easements and other easements that are located on the property are continuing to be shown. The preliminary and final plat do meet all of the requirements of the zoning and subdivision ordinance and are recommended for approval. One of the items that the applicant had identified that they would be interested in is having periodically the availability to have food trucks or food vendors at the site. And the zoning ordinance, city code, has a requirement for vendors. If you have vendors that are going to be just serving your employees, pretty much anybody can do that, and there's not any special requirements or permits needed for that. To serve the public, however, they need a transient merchant approval. And this would run with the land, and this means that at any point, these two sites that are shown on both the north part of the building and the south part of the building could be utilized at any point in time for food truck service. What needs to occur is that at the time a vendor comes in for the first time, they would need to register with the police department for their, they do a background check and get some information. And then once that's approved, they continue and can operate for the entire year. All of those particular licenses, if you will, all stop at the end of the year on December 31st, and then can be they can be applied for, reapplied for again next year. So in order to allow this, so that a future food truck vendor doesn't have to go in and go through its own individual conditional use permit or PUD amendment, we have rolled this in to the application here, and then what will happen is then the vendors or Valley will just need to do the registration for the transient merchant at the time that they want to open. When we talked about the new, or the revising the access to the north, basically what they're proposing to do is, again, this is a right-out, right-in, right-out only access. The applicant has been working with Dakota County on the plat and this access, and they've also been working with the adjacent property owner to the north. This property to the north is not within this same PUD, but they have had a maintenance, an operating maintenance agreement for use in the past, and will continue to have that in the future. The layout has been reviewed by our city engineer and the county, and both have no issues with what is proposed. One of the items that we need to address with, in terms of impervious surface, because the lot is within 1,000 feet of Alamagnet Lake, the zoning ordinance allows up to 30% impervious surface unless you get a conditional use permit, or in this case, it can be a PUD amendment. But it allows up to 75% as long as you go through the CUP or PUD process. The applicant is requesting 67% impervious. Previous PUDs allowed approval a little bit above 64% impervious. So although they are increasing the amount of impervious by 3%, they are still well below the 75% that the ordinance allows. In addition, and to impervious surface, they also need to then show how their site can provide and meet stormwater requirements to mitigate 1.5-inch storm. And they are showing a new underground system to be installed. And this is in addition to other existing facilities that are within this PUD, including there is a rainwater pond or rainwater garden south of the existing building, and also on the very northwest corner of Frontier Court, there is also a stormwater pond there. So those will be part of this. This overall system will be shared as well. This is just a graphic showing the drainage system. Again, this is the existing pond that I was just referring to, basically showing their proposed stormwater project. In terms of the exterior materials, for this particular project, the PUD established what the materials should be, and they're supposed to be consistent throughout the various buildings in the planned unit development. The applicant is proposing to use the same materials as on the existing building, which conform to the PUD, and those will be expanded onto the additions as shown. We did include the architectural review tool as well, but again, this PUD is really regulated through the planned unit development approvals. This would be the floor plan. As you can see, basically we've got a lot of the operational things going on. This would be the area where they would have the new juice coffee drive-through. And then this is a small area that'll be expanded for retail up in this area of the store. This shows the grading, drainage, and utility plan. If there are any specifics that Planning Commission or anyone in the audience would like to look at, I've just provided the plans. It's fairly straightforward in this case. We're basically removing existing buildings and parking lot area and then making the improvements. And this would be the proposed landscape plan. On this, staff has made some suggested changes that are included in the recommendations. And those primarily relate to where the drive-through is, to provide additional plantings, mostly for year-round effect, other than just the grasses, because in the winter the grasses get snowed on and basically don't provide much in terms of any type of screening or separation. So we have proposed some additional plantings in those areas, and I can address those if Planning Commission has further questions. The applicant did also provide a plan showing that the equipment, rooftop equipment, does get screened when viewed from the public right-of-way. We did add, or basically are just pulling forward the same condition that was in earlier PUDs, that the rooftop equipment also be painted. I believe the last item really that we have to look at relates to the, this is the building, County Road 11 would be on this side, and McAndrews would be in this location up here. So we're looking at, this is the existing loading area with the one dock, if you will, that's located here. This will be covered. There will be that additional small addition to the building here. And then they have their existing trash enclosure and then also compactors in this area. We have been working with the applicant because there is a requirement to provide screening of those areas from adjacent properties and from view from the public. And what they submitted is a plan that staff feels comfortable with. This is a different orientation here. North is to the top. And they are proposing that the compactor be located adjacent to where the new loading areas will be, and then are proposing a screening wall in this location. They have also shown within the existing trash area that they can fit the dumpsters. They have a place for future organics recycling, which is going to be required here shortly through the county, and that they have a place for recyclables. So this, I think, really meets the intent of what staff was looking for, and we feel comfortable with the applicant in providing this option. Another element that we had discussed are pedestrian access, and there is an access. Let me while I go back up. I don't know if you can, nope, can't see it on that one. Sorry for people. See, I thought there was. They are proposing a sidewalk on the south off of McAndrews, which I'll show you on the site plan. In addition, we thought from a staff perspective that there should be some type of access from County Road 11. And the applicant has been working to try to find a way to make that work. They have a proposal which staff is comfortable with. Sorry if I get, as I get all the way back here. In looking at bringing in a sidewalk from County Road 11 sidewalk and then through the property, meeting the requirements of the ordinance. One stipulation that they have indicated, this is a concept at this point in time, and we would have to work with them to make sure that ADA compliance can be met. But again, staff feels comfortable with the proposal that they've shown. And with that, we have a number of recommendations. There are a lot of conditions, but these are primarily due to there's a number of applications that we're dealing with here. I don't think that anything is out of the ordinary. Staff is recommending approval of the project, subject to the conditions that all of the previously approved CUP and PUDs, the related conditions remain in full force and effect, that they do need to provide us with a copy of the revised cross easements, cross parking agreements, maintenance agreements. Those will change as a result of the replat. So we've asked for that to be provided to us. That they will also enter into and record with Dakota County a shared maintenance agreement with the owners of Jane's Plaza. They're the property owners to the north where the access is proposed to be realigned. And then also that they will submit that. In terms of the trash enclosure, whoops, sorry about that, I'm ahead of myself. We feel that the applicant has met, with their plan that they are showing, has met this condition. So you could either leave item 4 in, but we could also take it out if, however, the Planning Commission feels most comfortable, but we are satisfied with the plan that they have proposed. Rooftop equipment be painted to match the building. Again, this is pulling forward a previous PUD standard. The sidewalk we just discussed, so they are showing potential for that. It would be subject to ADA compliance. The landscape plan, we're looking at some additional shrub plantings, primarily in the vicinity of the drive-through, just to meet that four-season screening. We are asking them to submit fixture specifications for the proposed wall lights. The lights are going to be similar to what's on the building, which does meet the ordinance. We just didn't have that, so we're asking for that as a condition. Developer shall enter into a license agreement with the city, and this is for use of the driveway access on the city's property. And that will be something that will be included with the development contract and legal documents once the project is approved. Developer shall not open the driveway access from the maintenance facility until September of 2017. And that is because that driveway is currently being used. It was just striped for additional parking for our police officers as they're moving out there until their facility is completed. So we're looking in terms of this, that driveway access actually not be used until September. Number 13 deals with a letter or documentation from the property owner to the north of operating and maintenance for the new revised access to County Road 11. And the final plat will need to be recorded with Dakota County. And the last one is that the development contract / amended PUD agreement will need to be executed by the applicant. With that, I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Garris. As a planning commission, we are very familiar with this planned unit development. Commissioners, questions for staff? Commissioner Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions. Ms. Garris, first one, the 75% impervious, is that even if the proximity of Lake Animag, that 75% still works for that?
Yes, if you're in a commercial or industrial zone, that's where you can go up to 75%, provided you provide the stormwater mitigation of that 1.5 inches.
Thank you. And the proposal is to 67?
Yes, that's correct.
Secondly, the drive-through from the city maintenance that we're talking about, that they have to get into an agreement with the city, and they have to pay some amount of money for the maintenance of that.
Yes.
It will be joint maintenance.
Yes, and I can, Mr. Hill Gardner can address that probably a little bit better than I can as to what's included in that.
Sure. Commissioners and Chair, what we did is we looked at the amount of heavy vehicle traffic being used by the maintenance facility as well as what's proposed by the applicant, tried to come up with a ratio for future maintenance based on a 40-year plan. And we basically weighed that based on the heavy vehicle traffic. So I don't know the exact percentage. It's not very much of what's going to be by Valley Foods, but that's how that number was derived.
Thank you. The trash compactor, item 4 on the conditions. Personally, I would like to see that remain. If management of Valley Foods change or so, they know what the requirement was when this agreement was approved, and so I would like to see that. Even though staff, the applicant has worked with staff and staff is satisfied, I would like to see that remain.
Thank you.
That's all for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Singh. Commissioner Workman.
I guess, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just one piece of clarification on reading the background. I thought I saw something about a new entry point or access to the building itself. Is there going to be new access points beyond maybe a westerly for employees?
Yes, that is, it's kind of hard to see here, but they are showing a sidewalk in this location here, so that you will be able to gain access at this location. And then I think the best way to show you is through the elevations. There will also be entrances. There's on the north side of the building, and then I believe also here is on the west elevation, additional accesses for employees.
So is the south elevation with the drive-through, that is just employee access? All consumer entrances will still maintain on the east
I believe that the access on the south, that the public will be able to use that as well as employees, but generally it's a drive-through type situation, so most of the general public is going to be entering through the existing front doors on the east elevation. And maybe the applicant, if you can address it a little bit more clearly
Okay.
than I.
Commissioner Workman, the applicant is signed up to talk, so
Okay.
we'll bring them.
I will table the follow-ups for that question until the applicant comes up. That was my only major question. Thank you, Deb.
Ms. Garros,
Before, Mr.
Oh.
Chair, if you would allow me, before you wrap up, I have one other question. I would like to-
Commissioner Singh, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very kind of you. Ms. Garris, regarding the traffic, I know the expansion of Valley Foods is good, and I think it's great that we use that area that has been abandoned for so long. Has there been any traffic concern of the people who attended that public meeting?
Yes, I think I will let, again, Mr. Hillgardner
Sure.
address that.
Commissioner Singh, there has been some concern at the meeting, just wondering about circulation and things of that nature. There was a traffic study that was included from the applicant, not only to evaluate site circulation, but also the intersection of Frontier Court and McAndrews. We reviewed those traffic studies and we're very comfortable. There's only an increase of 40 vehicles during peak hour in the morning, about 65 at peak hour in the PM, and we don't see any major traffic impacts to the site.
Thank you, Mr. Hillgarden. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Garros, just a couple of things that I know have come up in the past that I was hoping to clarify. As we read the background with the neighborhood meeting, there was questions based around speed bumps.
Yep.
And in our background, you had line itemed out A through K of the 1999 PUD conditions for the entire property, and speed bumps were not line listed in there. So I was a little confused. There was some statements in the background. So was there anything listed in the 1999 PUD that required speed bumps that wasn't in this, or could you enlighten me on that?
When we were at the neighborhood meeting, a couple of the residents had talked about that there were speed bumps that were installed, both on the north and south drive areas within the PUD. I researched the files and I did not find anything specific to speed bumps. There was information about how the buildings were made smaller, how this kind of S-curve was created for setbacks, and then also to have only one-way parking, if you will, to leave this open, and then also the same to leave the access open in this location. One of the business owners did indicate that they did have speed bumps out there until about a year ago when the parking lot needed to be redone, and that the contractor had identified for them that they recommended not putting the speed bumps back in. It's a cost factor. Also, the businesses out there had identified that they experienced more noise with the speed bumps as opposed to not having them, and it was their feeling that not having them is a better option. This is one item. I did not find anything specifically written in a PUD agreement or a report. That doesn't mean that there wasn't discussion about speed bumps. I just was not able to find a specific reference to that.
There was nothing officially recorded. There are 2 speed bumps still in place on the back drive, but the front drive's been redone. And if there's nothing in the PUD, then it's truly up to the landowner whether they want to put in speed bumps or not, correct? If there's nothing,
Yes, it's subject to,
Specifically
the
called out in
approvals
the
are
PUD.
really limited to, what the actual PUDs say. As I said, I was not able to find anything that included the speed bump language.
okay. We've also had a fair amount of questions with this PUD with other developments in reference to lighting. And there was some background from the neighborhood meeting in reference to lighting. And, you know, per normal standards, our number one recommendation, or not the most important, but number one, the very first one, all applicable conditions of previously approved PUDs shall remain in full force, and that is been determined that from the 1999 PUD that all site lighting except security lighting shall be turned off when the businesses are closed, correct? So
That's correct.
that would be how we're tying that back.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because I know that information was in the background, so. Other questions that came up while I was Commissioner Workman?
I was stewing on something while you're.
I could
was
sense
listening
that.
too, though. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brian, I just have a quick clarification question on the 40 vehicle per hour increase and the 64 on PM peak hours. Could you put that in perspective for me? Because I don't know, that could seem high to somebody, if I don't really understand what that's in comparison to.
Sure. Commissioner Workman and Commissioners Chair, it's actually a real low volume increase. We did talk to the applicant when they came in, and they've actually seen reduced traffic in the past here. So they actually anticipate that those numbers will actually kind of get them back to where they were previously. I don't have any specific examples, but something on the order of 200 to 300 vehicles per hour would be a higher number. This is anything under 100 vehicles per hour is a relatively low amount. I mean, you're talking about less than one vehicle per minute on average coming into the site or leaving the site. So relatively low amount.
Okay. Thank you. I just needed a little understanding of that in the grand scheme of things, so I appreciate it.
Commissioner Singh, do you have a question for Brian?
No,
Well, he does have a tie on, so we need to make sure we ask a lot of.
So not wearing a tie anymore.
Yeah, I know, we never.
I think Mr. Hilgardner will be the one answering this question. I will ask you, Ms. Garris, what I think. She will direct the question back to him. The required parking for this business is 197 spots.
Yes.
Okay. And the parking proposed is 136 spaces. And my notes show that staff is supporting that. Can you please give me the rationale for supporting that?
Yes, the applicant provided parking information, and also we did look back at the earlier PUD, the 99, 2000, and even the 2007 PUD. Valley Natural Foods is considered to be more of a specialty type grocer than, say, a Cub Foods or something of that sort. So they deemed that that would have lesser parking demand because it is more of a specialty type thing than general grocery. In addition to that, they took a look at other communities and then also national standards for parking. And the national standards for parking are closer to allowing, I believe it's, I get this right here, parking ratio of 4:2,000. They are asking for, let's see, the approved parking ratio for what is out there today is 6.2 spaces per thousand, and they are asking for approval of 5.07 spaces per thousand. So in looking at the specialty grocer aspect, which has been used in the past, also the national standards for grocery, and also they provided information on other communities with similar both co-ops and then regular grocery stores, and those numbers all bore out to be consistent with what they were asking, or even lesser numbers.
Thank you very much.
Commissioners, other questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Ms. Garris, can you please explain to me the walkway from County Road 11, the proposed walkway?
Yes.
My concern is, how wide is that walkway? And is it going to be striped or what?
What they've shown, there's the two walkways. This is the one that they're showing bringing in from McAndrews.
Yes.
And then they also gave a concept. This would be coming off the existing sidewalk in County Road 11. So this will be a 5-foot wide sidewalk. And then the ordinance does not allow just to stripe pedestrian ways. It needs to be made of an alternate material. And they are proposing to do that and then continue that sidewalk. This is an existing planter, so that would be continued. And then there would be a short pedestrian way at this location here to bring you to the front of the building.
Thank you very much. I think that this is very important because knowing that business, not only vehicular traffic, people walk from neighboring residential areas to over there. So I think that would be great. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Garros, that's similar to what we did with Chick-fil-A, Starbucks, Aldi?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And I'm assuming putting the sidewalk in a planter isn't going to cause an impervious surface problem?
There
Okay.
should not be an issue with that.
Okay. Any further questions? At this point, I'd like to ask the applicant to come up and give us their name and address for the record, and I think Commissioner Workman has a couple of questions. Mr. Bade, thanks for coming. Please give us your name and address for the record.
Yes, thank you, Commissioners. Chair, my name is David Bate. I'm with Westwood Professional Services. I'm the development and engineering consultant for Valley Natural Foods. We have a couple of folks with us. Actually, Sue McGahee with Valley Natural Foods is the manager of the existing facility. Also, Kevin Green from Wilkes Architects. And actually, Sue is going to just talk briefly about some operations and just how excited they are to be able to bring some additional expansion. Then I'm here to basically answer any questions more from the site and engineering, and Kevin Green more on the architectural if anything comes up. So
We'll have a couple of questions, I think, from Commissioner Workman.
Absolutely.
Please step up to the podium and give us your name and address for the record. Thanks for coming.
I'm Susan McCoy, and my home address or my
The
work address?
Yes, fine.
Home address? I live on.
Your work address is fine, the address.
Okay.
I realize but for the record.
Okay, it's 13705 County Road 11.
Thank you.
We're excited to be celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And when we first expanded to this site, we probably had less than 500 customers per day. We had a small kitchen. Well, it seemed large to us at that time. Deli was introduced as a new department for Valley Natural Foods. Our fresh departments are the fastest growing departments in our operation, and so we need to expand those. This expansion will allow us to have a larger kitchen to serve more of our fresh deli, which is expanding quickly, the prepared foods. It also moves it moves those operations back into that 8,000 square feet, which gives us about 3,000 square feet more of retail. So we can expand our aisles and it won't be so crowded for our customers. So they'll have a better customer experience. So.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Commissioner Workman, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. McCoy, for the background. And it was Mr. McGahee, correct?
yes, that was my bad.
Oh, that's all right. I'm just glad I remembered it. The main concern with this, and I think with our friends across the street, is the activity and the noise and the light on that side of the road. And so that's kind of where my question was pointed about consumer access to that door would create more activity on the southerly facing side of that building. Can you just give me a little more information on that?
I don't have numbers. Kevin, do you have specific numbers? Or Sue, do you have specific numbers of maybe some guests more from walk-ins instead of the drive-through?
Walk-ins from?
From the south side.
From the south side. I do not.
Why don't you come back up?
We don't have specific numbers because there hasn't been a public access in the past. It's an exit. We do expect that there will be, periodically people that will run in to get coffee or a sandwich or something. It'll be a short-term type of, run in, run out. So I think there are only 5 or 6 parking places right there for them to be able to do that.
So will that, I'm sorry, will that have a separate definition maybe as the entry point for the cafe as opposed to the grocery shopping? I mean, will customers be aware of that? Or will that be any, obviously you can go into the grocery store from there, but is that the intended use of that entry point is to enter for the cafe or the coffee shop?
It's mostly for the coffee and juice bar, yes.
Okay.
The coffee and juice bar are situated right there. We do have the food service, but our dining room's toward the front of the building, the southeast side of the building, yeah.
Okay. And then with this expansion, is there plans for that part of it to maybe dine in and eat, or is it kind of a grab and go? Or can you tell me a little bit more about the plans for that piece of the expansion? It wouldn't be like a restaurant experience. It would be more like a more fast casual, but kind of come in, get what you need, and leave type scenario. Or
Are you talking about the parking there or
that entry point and that specific use with the coffee shop and the I'm calling it a deli, but the food.
Right now we have our seating area, and so that's dine-in, but it's up front. And that particular in and out, it would be probably not dine-in, but, come in and get coffee, juice, pick up a sandwich or something and come out.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Singh.
If you don't mind, ma'am, please come on up.
yes.
I think you do have some dining area for dining, don't you?
We do presently, yes.
Yeah, I had lunch there.
Yes.
I know. When you said you didn't, so I know.
No,
that.
I meant the back
expansion.
area is
Yeah.
not the dine-in area so much as we already have a dine-in area sort of, but you have to pick up your food and go up there
That's
and
right.
pay for it, yeah.
That's right. That's all.
Okay. Thank you. I think you could, kind of a little bit of an aerobic workout this evening, but thanks for your time. Commissioners, other questions for the applicant? Did you have anything for us?
I didn't. I'm just happy to answer any questions you might
Okay,
have.
all right. I don't think we have any additional questions.
Okay.
So,
Excellent.
this is a public hearing, so at this point, I would like to open the public hearing. And I would like anyone in the audience who would like to speak to this item to come to the podium and give us your name and address for the record. Good evening, sir. Please give us your name and address for the record.
My name is Jim Giebel. I live at 1701 Victoria Lane.
Welcome back, Mr. Giebel.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, Commissioners. Usually I drew the short straw and had to come here and speak. After a neighborhood meeting back in May,
We don't take that the wrong way.
that's good. I didn't mean it the wrong way. But I volunteered to come because I thought we had a pretty good project coming forward. The night's kind of changed a little bit of that, a couple things that have come up that I don't think we were aware of. I had 4 or 5 phone calls when I got home this evening. So I know, Deb, you read about 15 things that need to be done in order to meet the PUD conditions. Little disappointed, I guess, some of the things that were talked about at the neighborhood meeting didn't appear on those. And a couple have been brought up by you gentlemen tonight. One of those was delivery schedule times. That is a concern. The loading dock, unloading dock was on the far northeast corner, and now it's moved further west, closer to the residents. Much larger dock for larger trucks, as was indicated by the drive-in and what's needed to get those larger trucks in. So, I guess we anticipate more noise from that. So to have some type of condition of times when those trucks can come in, especially in the mornings. Right now, we hear the beeping, 5 o'clock, 5:15, 5:30. It would be nice to have a little bit later time for that. I don't know if that can be accommodated in the grocery business or not. Not familiar with it. Hours for the drive-through, nothing was indicated there. Don't know if that's earlier, later, same as store hours. It'd be nice to see something along those lines. The public access point that you talked about, Commission or Workman, was a little bit of a concern. I guess, it's one of those things, pick your battles. I think there's 8 parking spots there. I don't know, maybe somebody wants to confirm that, but as long as the restaurant part, that was a concern. It stays up front. I don't see a lot of people probably using that rear entrance. It's not going to be that convenient to park there and walk to the front of the building to eat or what have you, but that was a concern of the neighborhood. Speed bumps, Mr. Broderick brought that up, and I'll let it be whatever the city decides on movement on that. Lighting has always been a concern. I appreciate the changes that were made based on the May 18th meeting. Big difference. They go off at 10:30 Monday through Sunday, which has been much appreciated, that we tried through many years to get that done, and it got done. So that's a good thing. Dark sky ordinance, I don't know if the city's ever looked at that. Most cities do now. Basically, it's trying to get rid of light pollution, where all the light is downward facing. And if you Google it, you'll find thousands and thousands of articles from Tucson to Phoenix to LA to San Francisco, whatever. And I think it's something that should be looked at. I don't know if anything can be done at this time on the project. But, lighting is, not good for a lot of different reasons, for wildlife and such. Landscaping, I know there's been a little bit of discussion on that, but again, the more that we can put between the project and the residents, the better. Actually, many people commented on the grass, that they like the grass and it looks like it's going to be removed, so there you have that. The biggest thing that kind of came out tonight I guess everybody probably printed off the agenda, and that was the CUP amendment for the transient merchants. Something that was not discussed at the neighborhood meeting. I'd print this off late today, probably 4:30, when I was leaving work, and then when I got home and had my messages. So I guess that's something, to me it seems quite odd, a little disconcerting actually, that we can just write into a PUD that we can bring in as many food trucks as we want, on as many days, nights, evenings, weekends as we want. That's, a carte blanche. I don't know if anybody has that in Burnsville. I know I frequent some brew pubs, and there'll be, 1 or 2 food trucks kind of there in that situation. But this, I think, is a little bit different. So, I don't know, Deb, you mentioned a little bit about the process that a food truck merchant would have to normally go through, but this would kind of circumstance that, it sounds like, that they'll have it, and any food truck can come in as long as they buy their license or what have you. And I know Burnsville's been very specific about the use of food trucks within the city, and I don't know all the details of that. I guess I'd like to know if that's been done in any other locations within the Burnsville proper for that. And I guess it looks to me it's pushing the envelope of the project. We started with a fast food place, and now if we have food trucks, 2, 3, 4, whenever. I mean, it just totally open. There's no limit, days, times, hours. To me, that's a problem that the neighborhood will pursue. Here tonight, at the next council meeting, wherever, that came through loud and clear with that. So I'd like probably to hear a little bit more discussion on that. I mean, food trucks are noisy. They have large generators on them. They draw a lot more people, a lot more cars, which is good. I understand business that, you want to do that, but and then you get in the point of just more people hanging around, loitering, litter, that sort of thing. So I think it's just out of the blue. Maybe it's been in there, nobody saw it. Everybody, like I say, was probably printing off this thing from today's agenda, and it's become a little bit of a major concern. So that's all I have this evening.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you, sir. Ms. Garrell, so I guess I'll have a couple of questions based around that. So delivery times, we typically have not limited delivery times to, what do we have in the past history with delivery times for deliveries, I guess?
Well, I think in this case, limiting delivery times because you have the city's maintenance facility with snowplows and all sorts of trucks going in and out of there, I don't see that as something that would be very helpful in this case. It's one of those things like speed bumps. You can put it in there. You have to see somebody violating it to do something about it. I think Valley Natural Foods has operated out there for many, many, many years and has shown what type of operator they are. And if that's something the Planning Commission would like to address, you certainly can do that through plan unit development. That is up to you if you would like to do so.
Okay,
May I follow up on your question?
yes.
Ms. Garris, Mr. Gable said that unlimited amount of trucks, food trucks can come in there. Is that really true? I mean,
I was gonna get to food trucks. Can we,
He's got a list.
yeah, I got a list. I was
okay,
gonna try to do food. Okay.
I can wait until
Okay.
you come.
So, that's the delivery time question. The next question was based around the drive-through hours. I would assume, I would make an assumption that the drive-through would not have different hours than the operation itself?
The drive-through opens around 6:30.
Okay. And the PUD does not exceed 6 AM to 10 PM, so I think we're okay there?
Yes.
Yep, okay. I gotta get back to my list. I guess we discussed the public access point to the south. Commissioner Workman, did you have any additional questions based around that?
No, it didn't sound like that was overly concerning for the neighborhood, which was kind of what prompted my initial question, so I'm satisfied with the answers we received.
It does, there are, Mr. Giebel was correct, there are, I think on the plan, 8, including a handicap stall. But it certainly seems like from an operational standard, the sit-down part, where I have also eaten before, is up front. And so this would be like stopping in at a Starbucks, I guess, or something, and getting coffee and leaving. Okay, so let's talk about food trucks. Commissioner Singh, I'll let you start.
I had this, my number one item to have a discussion, and Mr. Gable brought it up. According to him, he's saying unlimited number of trucks. I can understand one truck being there at any one time, but to have 2 or 3, 4 trucks.
Commissioners, the site plan that was included in your packet goes along with this. That shows a potential of 2 trucks. One on the north side, one on the south side. This just came up a couple of weeks ago. The applicant had just identified that they had some interest from a coffee company to have coffee. And based on Burnsville's ordinance, if you want to sell to the general public, you need a transient merchant approval to do that. And that requires a conditional use permit or a planned unit development. since they're already proceeding with this planned unit development and we had the time to include it, we added it to this. This, I think, goes along with the council and planning commission's desire not to make individuals go through a lot of time and cost for individual conditional use permits if you don't have to. The city has approved transient merchants before. We have approved them primarily, the ones that I'm familiar with that I can recall offhand are all for fireworks sales. They've been approved at the Burnsville Center, at the Walmart parking lot. There's another one, I think, at Aurora Village, for example. So we're looking at 2 trucks. They would be limited to the hours of operation of the store, which is limited by the planned unit development, the same hours that date back to 1999.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say the request that came into your office was more about a demo, and this company was coming out. Organic Valley was coming out to demo, and they wanted to know if they could have their food truck there, sort of as an advertisement that they were there. They would serve things out of there, but it wasn't necessarily for sale. It was more for demoing the product that we sell in the store. We probably don't want food trucks out in front of our store because we sell the food.
Okay. Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to speak? I don't know. Mr. Root, come on. The public hearing's still open.
Brian Root, 13795
Root.
Frontier Court.
Thanks for coming back.
Thank you. Celadon Systems, we're the westernmost building.
We remember.
And I want to say we wholeheartedly are thrilled with this development. We're going to be tearing down that eyesore of a car wash, and we're thrilled. We especially like the south entrance that you guys were just talking about because it's going to be more safe for our employees because we go over there for lunch a lot. And right now we tend to go around the back because it gets us to the front door easier and there's trucks going back and forth. So we are thrilled to have that sidewalk to get us in the side to grab a sandwich and go back to the office. But we are very thrilled with this entire development. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to this item? Yes, Ms. Keeble, come back up.
Regarding the food trucks, Jim Giebel, 1701 Victoria Lane. Regarding the food trucks, if your statement is accurate, Susan, to say something to that effect then, I think would be more appropriate and not open up to food trucks. I mean, I'm more than happy to do demo trucks, you know, your events, and those things are great, the bands and that sort of thing, you know, to have that sort of thing. But if you read that and take it literally, it's wide open. And that's not a good thing, I don't think, that, you know, and just because there's a map that shows 2, there's nothing that says that's 2 per day, 2 for every 4 hours, you know, whatever it is. You know, there could be a burrito guy in the morning and somebody else in the afternoon. So, you know, I guess to get to the point is just let's define it, make it accurate, so it can be acceptable and the project can move on. Thanks.
Anyone else in the audience that would like to speak to this item? Seeing no one, I will close the public hearing. Ms. Garros, let's, I think we've discussed the transient license, that it's, if I understand this correctly, it's not just food trucks. The license allows someone to sell, as you said, fireworks or have a food truck. Anybody else, another location in town, our process is what? That the actual food truck itself could apply for the conditional use permit?
Either the vendor can apply as long as the application signed by the property owner, or the property owner can apply. This would not be for selling anything. This is specific to food trucks.
Okay.
And for them, whether they sell or provide to the general public, they need a transient merchants to be able to do so.
So it is a specific license for that type of truck, it's not
Yes.
a
The PUD
blanket license.
Right, the other PUDs where we've done transient merchants for fireworks, the fireworks has been called out in the PUD approval, just like food trucks are called out in this one.
Okay. So do we have any history where we've done anything where we've called out, I mean, I guess I'd like to answer the question from a standpoint of if the map says 2, then we are only allowing 2?
The
That-
planning commission, you can recommend whatever you like. As I said, we included it so that the business would be able to operate the way that they had requested. The conditions are up to planning commission as to what you'd like to see.
Commissioner Singh, you had a question?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think Ms. McCoy explained that they were not interested in having food trucks there on a regular basis selling to the public. What she talked about was a truck, a demo truck, with stuff that they would normally sell in Valley Natural Foods. That's my understanding. My understanding is not that you allow trucks to come in and sell food. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
The planning commission, if you want it to be more specific than 2 food trucks, you need to identify that and put those in the conditions, if that's your purview.
That is not something we've done in the past, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Commissioner Workman?
My only concern with this is that it, would run with the property. So while Ms. McCoy might not have the intention of doing food trucks, at some point in the future, somebody could. And then do we have an issue later with the neighborhood? I wouldn't mind adding some definition, but not overly constrictive to the point where we're saying you shall only do this on this day to this time, but maybe to Mr. Giebel's point, just give it some type of framework. Other than, as it's written right now, Deb, it's just 2 locations for food trucks.
Yes,
No more, no less, that's just what it says.
correct.
I'd
Go
be
ahead.
willing to listen to what you guys think about that, or just giving it to some broader or more concise definition than where it says now.
Well, Ms. Garros, if we were going to do that, would that require a 16th, how would we call that out?
Yes, you would identify it as a condition,
As a condition.
As a separate condition?
yes.
And that condition, we would have to specify that from a standpoint of limiting it, or I typically am not in favor of additional conditions. This particular property is already, has a fair amount of them.
Mr. Chair, I'm not overly passionate about that particular topic. I just think that listening to Mr. Giebel speak, it sounds like that's probably the more pertinent issue for the neighborhood, and to try to, obviously, Valley Natural's made probably a lot of concessions in this expansion, but
Would you feel comfortable that we just spelled out that there could be no more than 2 food trucks on site at one time?
I would maybe appeal to Ms. McCoy and see if you were comfortable with that, or if we're gonna have a,
Excuse me, you're just saying no more than food
No
2?
more than 2 trucks on site at one time?
That would be fine.
That would be fine? Okay.
and I'm comfortable with that, if all parties involved are comfortable with that.
Ms. Garros, we probably have no condition that we could make an adjustment to, so that would need to be a condition number 16? Okay. And that condition would be worded as stated that that would be limited to 2 food trucks on the premises during operational hours?
Yes,
Okay,
that would work.
okay. Commissioners, other questions? I guess at this point, if you don't, I would take comments before we try to move to a vote. Commissioner Singh?
No, I don't I have exhausted my
Yeah.
questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Then I would entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair, I would be thrilled to recommend that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council approval of the PUD amendment, CUP and preliminary plat, subject to the following 15 conditions, as well as the added 16th condition that states that there shall be no more than 2 food trucks allowed on site during standard operating hours.
Mr. Chair, it's my honor and privilege to second that motion.
We have a motion on the floor and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. That will go in front of the city council. They told me this, and I gotta flip back and find it. It's June 20th.
June 20th.
You know, you buy them books and send them to school and they forget stuff. Thank you for coming this evening. We're excited to have, I think this application, it narrows it down from 4 property owners to 3. I see a lot of good things about this application. I'm excited that Valley Natural Foods is expanding in the city of Burnsville. So thank you for coming. That brings us to item number 4 this evening. This is also a public hearing. It's an application of the city of Burnsville to consider amending City Code Title 10 zoning chapters 7, 12, and 14 and 18 to remove exterior building and structure compatibility standards for single-family, 2-family, and manufactured homes. Our presenter this evening is Ms. Garros.
Thank you, members of the Planning Commission. This application is coming before you. I did provide in the background information from the City Council work session that was held on this. The topic was brought up, first of all, at the all-day retreat with the council in, I believe it was January, February this year. Then we had a work session with council and have gone through all of the various elements. There was also a PowerPoint presentation, and we included that with your packet. And what the recommendation was from the City Council is they wanted staff to draft an ordinance to remove compatibility requirements in the single-family and 2-family, and then this would also affect manufactured home parks as well. It affects requirements for exterior materials, basically, and requirements that they be compatible. You'll find in the ordinance there are a lot of additional references to compatibility other than what we're looking at tonight. Most of those are in the commercial, industrial, and multifamily zones. And as you know, we are working with WSB to take a look at those building standards. And once that study is done and we have direction from the council, most likely the compatibility standards will change in those districts as well. However, this is the direction that we have from the City Council. Staff prepared the draft that's in your packet, and this does require a public hearing. In terms of the, really the changes are fairly straightforward. We're taking out the compatibility so that basically when you're looking at a residential building, it used to be that you had to have compatible materials if you had duplexes, side by side, for example, a duplex. And a lot of times those are further regulated by PUDs or conditional use permits. In those cases where there are existing PUDs and conditional use permits that require certain materials, that will continue. This ordinance would not change that, but would apply to anything else that's not already regulated. And the types of things that will be changing will be, for example, if you have like a garage, for instance, or a shed, you will no longer, those materials for those buildings will no longer have to be compatible with what's used on the principal building. This will also allow for metal sheds, for example, which have not been permitted in the city before. But that was the direction from council. Also, screening fences and walls on page 2 or the second page, we're taking out compatibility requirements there. Again, used to read that they needed to be compatible with the materials on the principal building. primarily throughout the code. That's what we are proposing. And there are, under the moving and relocating building instructions, and structures, there were compatibility requirements, because there was a concern at one time if you're moving in homes or other buildings from other places, that they should be compatible with the neighborhood. Those provisions would be removed. And then we have the specific removals shown under the R1 zone, and those also apply to the R1A zone as well. And then R2, and also the manufactured home parks. So with that, I am open for questions that you might have. That is really the premise of this particular amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Garros. I was at the work session, I think you, or Jenny, or you and I presented, I think, if I remember
Yes.
correctly. I would like to just clarify one thing, and we talked about this. We'll go back to the application we had with the duplex on 112th Street, where the two duplexes were different. The applicant was in front of us for vinyl siding versus what was
Correct.
on it.
Exactly.
And we spent a fair amount of time, because it was an easier process when the material was the same, to make sure that there was no water damage. And so we're not removing anything. There's still going to be some sort of building code requirement that if applicant A, who's putting new siding on their duplex, they are then responsible for the securing or the making sure that there's no water leak or any damage to the other side.
That's correct.
And so-
You still need to meet all building and fire code requirements. It's just they don't need to be the same color,
Yeah.
texture, or specific material.
So the applicant, when they come in and get their building permit, then would be required as to however they're going to flash it and make sure they're not causing other issues.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, that will not change.
Thank you, Ms. Garros. Commissioners, questions for Ms. Garros?
Mr. Chair, I have just one quick.
Commissioner Workman.
Thank you. Deb, I don't remember if it's in this or the next application, but, or I'm sorry, the next item, but there was a reference to garish colors or bright pinks, oranges, and so on. That, with this change, would allow that.
You can paint it any color you want with
Okay.
this change. Doesn't matter.
I'm going shopping tomorrow.
As long as you meet the code, the necessary
As long
code.
as it's a material that's approved based on building and fire code.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify that point. Thank you.
Commissioner Singh, any questions?
Nope, I think it's very straightforward. It's being done to clarify. That was a problem. We had that several times before the planning commission. I'm glad that staff and the city council decided to look into it and bring something to us, and I'll just support it.
I would stand for a motion.
Need a public hearing.
Oh, gosh. I'm sorry. This is a public hearing. I would like to open the public hearing and ask anyone in the audience that would like to speak to this item to step up to the podium and give us your name and address for the record. Anyone in the audience that would like to speak to this item? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. I do that a lot lately.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Singh.
I beg to move that the planning commission recommend to the city council approval of the ordinance amended as presented.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Singh, second by Commissioner Workman. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And opposed, say nay, and the motion carries 3-0.
Thank you.
That brings us to item number 5 on our agenda this evening, and this is also a public hearing. Application of the City of Burnsville for amendment to City Code Title 10 zoning, Chapter 30 signs related to wall graphics and murals. Ms. Dean, you are presenting this evening. Nice to give Ms. Garros a rest for at least a few minutes.
Couple minutes, we'll see how long this takes. So, thank you, Chair, members of the commission. Probably about a month and a half ago, the city was approached by the Burnsville Convention and Visitors Bureau to paint a mural on a city wall. Specifically, they were looking at the garage location just across from the new skate park, or revised skate park. They presented in front of city council at a work session, and it was determined that although there may be support and consensus for support for a mural, that our city ordinances don't really address murals. In fact, murals aren't listed, therefore it's prohibited within the city of Burnsville. And we also have a section that talks about wall graphics, which, again, it's listed as a prohibited material or prohibited application within our sign ordinance. So at that work session in May, it was determined by the council that they did want to make some changes to our ordinance to allow murals within the city of Burnsville. So we're before you tonight with some proposed language that's included in your packet. With any ordinance change, we often go out to our market cities to see what they do. 11 cities are within that market city grouping, which we compare ourselves to. Of the market cities, 7 responded to a survey that I presented to them. Questions asked were if murals were allowed within the city, if murals were considered public art, or if murals were considered signs. Another question asked was if brick was allowed to be painted, and then just other comments were provided. Kind of all over the place. However, majority of the communities that do allow murals do consider them art. If there's any language that speaks to commercial speech, it's considered a sign. There were restrictions on painting of brick or painting of stone that was prohibited in some cities. However, some cities did say that, for example, Bloomington, you could have a mural, you have to paint that on a separate surface and then attach it to a wall. Some cities did allow murals through a planned development or planned unit development process. With that information and knowing that City Council does want the city to move forward with some sort of mural process and to allow it in some fashion, staff developed some language, including a definition of a mural, specifically the definition, original art mural. It would be a hand-painted image on or affixed to an exterior wall of a building that is coordinated with a commissioned artist and is non-commercial in nature, and any building surface could have a mural. So any building could be painted, brick building could be painted. We also are proposing language to our sign section that basically allows original art murals as a permitted use, so it's explicitly as permitted, and that in our prohibited section of our city code, we do mention wall graphics, and we wanted to make the distinction between the two, wall graphics versus murals. So we're saying wall graphics, except original art murals wall graphics are basically prohibited where murals are permitted. So in a red line version in your packet, as well as on our screen, proposed language changes. We do want this to be, have your discussion, have your input on if changes should be made to the ordinance language presented in front of you. You may want to consider some things, specifically the language today that's proposed. It would be, murals would be allowed throughout the city. So it could be on a park building, a school building, a commercial building, as long as it's non-commercial in nature, kind of a public art piece. Do you want to limit it to public buildings, to schools, to churches, for example? Or are you fine having the availability of public art to be anywhere within the city? Should murals be painted on the exterior wall surface? Does it matter if it's brick? Does it matter if it's a concrete block, part of a wall or building? Or in Bloomington's case, how they do allow the painting of a surface attached architecturally integrated into a building. Would you prefer that? And then should we place limitations on mural size? Does that matter? And those are some questions to hopefully spark Oh, also, I missed one. Do you have concerns with long-term maintenance? So whether it's painted and it starts to peel off of a surface, or, and again, using Bloomington as an example, do you have concerns with someone putting up a mural image, putting holes in a wall, taking it down, and maybe not replacing it? Is that a concern that you want included into potential language? Basically, I have two recommendations up. One, you could recommend as proposed and presented. Or if you think that you need more information, that you want to discuss further, that you want this brought back in front of you with more information, we can certainly do that as well and have the item tabled. So with that, I'll leave it up to you. I can certainly stand for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. To your point about peeling paint, that would then fall back to a code enforcement, correct?
Property maintenance, correct.
Okay. Okay. Commissioners, other questions for Ms. Dean?
Mr. Chair, no.
Commissioner Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Dean, right now, do we have anything on our books for murals?
It's not specifically murals is not specifically called out. That's one reason it would be prohibited. And then if you look at the wall graphics, it would imply that that could be used as a mural definition, and
Okay.
wall graphics are specifically listed as prohibited. So they're prohibited unless you wanted to request a plan unit development for a specific project as part of your development. So if Valley Natural Foods, that you just heard from before, wanted to include a mural as part of their PUD on one of their walls, we could allow that through that process.
If the students of a school want to do a mural or something on the wall, exterior wall of a school, they would have to come to the city, get a permit?
They would
The
have
school have to
to,
get a permit?
they would have to request a plan unit development
PUD.
request
Okay,
and
PUD.
go before the planning commission and city council. So a 60 to 90 day process. Application fee.
Could I clarify
Sure,
something with that
sure.
question? Okay. Ms. Dean, so let's say this ordinance was enacted as stated. And let's go back to your Valley Natural Food application. So in the PUD that they have, it is not specifically called out that you could not have it. So once this is enacted, then they could. Or since we are a city of PUDs, educate me on whether it's specifically stated or not stated.
That's a good question. If there was specific language in a, typically how it's handled is if there's specific language within the PUD that specifies uses or building types or building application, building materials, it usually gets pretty specific, sometimes colors. Oftentimes we would require a PUD amendment. It would likely come before you. So I could see if it's specifically called out, we have specific plans that address a specific building, very well could be coming before you anyway.
So with this ordinance, they still would have to come in for a
They may have to.
permit to paint. City would administratively look at it and see that there's nothing restrictive in the PUD, and they would be given a permit to put the mural up?
That,
Is how this will be enforced?
well, we would look at the plan, and if it was specifically called out as needing to be face brick, and specific colors, then that's the plan that runs with the approval. So if you want to vary from that, deviate from that, then you would have to come through the process again.
Well, no, I guess I didn't. So as this ordinance is stated, if, to Commissioner Singh's question, let's say the high school or one of the elementary schools wants to paint a mural on the side of the school. Before they paint that mural, would they come in for a permit, or can they just paint the mural?
So they would presumably call the city, and we would determine, one, if there's a planning and development or not.
Okay.
Let's say there's not, then they would go through a permitting process, just over the, basically, not over the counter, but, I mean, within a week or two,
I think
they
you
would
were
get
both
their
asking
permit.
this question.
sure,
You
I
just-
think
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Singh, other questions?
Ms. Dean, will the city have anything to do with the content of the mural or the aesthetics of the mural? Or, for example, if they're gonna put words, and this is just an example, if they're gonna put words that are racist, can be considered racist, will the city say no, or whatever they present to the city?
We can't control the content of the message if it's non-commercial speech, it's freedom of speech, so there would be concerns with regulating that.
I understand that, thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Other questions, Commissioner Singh? Commissioner Workman?
Hey, Mr. Chair, I just had a couple of notes. Ms. Dean, can you tell me what defines a commissioned artist? Do they have to have some type of certification? I don't know, that's probably not your background to define things like that. But that seems like a loophole to me slightly, because I don't know what a commissioned artist is.
Typically would be someone that you maybe have a request for a proposal for people to react to apply to be an artist for a specific work, or you specifically pay someone to do specific work.
So somebody who's paid to paint would then be considered a commissioned artist?
Right.
So really, I mean, then anybody could paint a mural on any wall if they're being paid to do that? Okay. I hesitated on residential, but I kind of pulled back on that a little bit. And then my only concern, one of your lead questions was the size and scope, or the murals be, or was it, should there be a limit on the size of the murals? The only thing that popped into my head was if it was a mounted mural, I don't think that the mounted mural should exceed the size of the wall. So you've got a mural that's larger than the wall that it hangs on. And I don't know if maybe a building code would prevent that from happening in the first place. But that was really the only thing that kind of came up when I saw that question, is I wouldn't want, that might be over the line. I mean, the intent of this is to allow freedom of expression, and I understand that, but that to me seems like, I don't know that somebody would do that, but that seems like a potential for a problem to me, but. Other than that, those are my only real questions.
Commissioner Singh?
Ms. Dean, number one, should locations be limited to specific areas such as in public buildings, churches, or schools, for example? I think it should be limited. I'm just giving direct answers to your question. I think it should be limited. I would friendly advise that we change churches to buildings of worship to make it inclusive. Should murals be painted on any exterior wall? The answer is no for me. For example, I don't expect to see it on I'm driving down the street and the wall facing the street should not be. That's just me. Maintenance should be part of code enforcement. And I'm not sure what we do with number 4. Should there be limits on the size of a mural? We have to take aesthetics into consideration, because it can be an eyesore if it's huge and buildings next to them have to look at it all the time. Should there be limits on the size? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Singh. Ms. Dean, I know Minneapolis and St. Paul allow this. In our market cities, we would be the only one that's allowing people to paint brick, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And this, there's a lot of things that come in front of us that are pretty straightforward. This is something that I don't have a lot of experience with. And I do apologize, I did not educate myself on council direction. So the consensus of the council with this was as you wrote the ordinance?
Maybe if I can clarify two things. Brick is allowed to be painted in Brooklyn Park and Apple Valley. May be considered an architectural treatment, so clarification on that. And there was just general consensus from the council to allow murals basically anywhere. And that was the direction, and directed us to come back with an ordinance change.
Okay. Okay. And then we do believe we would have something in reference to, as the paint would peel off, that we could call out to have it repaired as if we would paint on a normal building.
That's correct.
They could call out that this is peeled off and you need to either paint over it or bring it up to its original standard.
Correct. We
code
would, from a
enforcement.
property maintenance standpoint, we would work with the owner to bring it, repaint it would probably be an option.
Okay.
Repair, repaint.
I'll open the public hearing. Commissioner Workman.
Well, I can maybe wait till after the public hearing.
Okay. This is a public hearing. I'd like to open the public hearing and ask anyone in the audience that would like to speak to this item, please step up to the podium and give us your name and address for the record. Seeing no one rushing to the podium, I will close the public hearing. Commissioner Workman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would maybe like to, well, not maybe, I would like to maybe, try not to say maybe, I would like to add that maybe this, there you go again, come before us again in a year for review, similar to other things that we've done, just to see if there's any potential problems with it that need to be adjusted. This seems like we went from black to white fairly quick, from saying absolutely not to kind of go ahead and do whatever you want. So I think there should be some type of review process, at least in a year or 2 years, just to make sure that if Commissioner Singh's point, there's something that maybe needs to be addressed in the ordinance, we could address it, if that's possible.
Thank you, Commissioner Workman. Either Ms. Garros or Ms. Dean, help me with when we ask for that stuff, because sometimes we ask for that a lot. That typically is not going to be written into the ordinance. It's just typically from an administrative standpoint, something you put on the agenda. Help us with when we ask for that, what kind of burden that is.
I think you can, one of the things you can do is recommend that this is an interim ordinance and that it's on, basically on the books for a year. And at that point would be a trigger to come back after a year. We've done that for other things like legacy event signs recently. So that'll be, it's kind of a test to see if it works, if it's appropriate for Burnsville, if there's any changes, additions, modifications. So it could be, that could be a recommendation if you want.
I would be comfortable with that.
And does that give you, so do we need, you need a motion, but we don't have conditions. So you would need a motion from one of the commissioners to say that we would like this to be an interim ordinance.
That would be a recommendation,
And that would be the only other direction you need from us?
unless you want to make any other changes to the language that I have presented today.
Okay. Commissioners, other questions? I would stand for a motion.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Workman, I beg to move that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council approval of this interim ordinance and as presented, and that it be brought back to the Planning Commission within a year for us to revisit it.
Second.
Wordsmith that.
Does that work
That's fine.
for you? Okay. I have a motion on the floor. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Workman. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed say nay, and the motion carries. That brings us to item number 6, which is the discussion on architectural materials and alternative material review. Eric, you have the floor. I'm trying to get stuff moved around here so I can get all of my material on the counter.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
And Planning Commission. I can appreciate that we've given you a lot of material and some of them in odd sizes, so I can appreciate that. It may take you a minute to get situated.
I think we're ready.
Okay, thank you. So to review how this project got started, the purpose of this study is twofold: to review to see if the architectural materials in which Burnsville requires, is that similar with 11 other cities? And just to expand, there was a city council work session in which a number of examples were in Bloomington and Richfield, which are two communities that are not normally your comparison cities. So in this case, it was expanded to add those two. Then secondly, which is in addition to the question of, which architectural materials should be allowed, if an individual or a company requests a deviation from what's specifically written in the code, what is that process? And is there ways to do that easier than currently within city code? So what we did is take those two and basically make a graph out of that, where the horizontal axis is an axis of how specific Burnsville's requirements within their code is, compared to the vertical axis. I'm not sure if I misspoke earlier. The horizontal axis is how specific your material is. Vertical axis is the process, how many bodies, how much time is taken to grant a deviation. Why we developed that is you can see that the cities are scattered throughout that graph. When you look at how specific communities are, Egan is very specific in that not only do they have specifications down to the individual zoning districts, they have specifications depending on where it's facing or how far away from a public right-of-way. Where Burnsville has specific items, but doesn't go into, is it treated differently on one surface compared to another? While communities such as Richfield and Minnetonka have very little language. Minnetonka basically has no language. So on that continuum, Burnsville is about in the middle. You have a list of specific items, but in many cases you don't go as far as, one example is windows. You talk about glass. But in other communities, there are restrictions on the transparency of that window. So part of the language is it spandrel glass, which essentially is a glass that was specifically made to be opaque, that you can't see through it. You don't contain that language. When you talk about brick, it's just simply brick. Talk about windows or glass, it's just simply glass. So you're in the middle of that horizontal spectrum. When we look at the administrative process, there are some communities that allow deviations to individual staff members, whether in some cases the zoning director or the city manager or city administrator, to other cases where the only way you're going to get a deviation is through a text amendment or a variance. Now I will just pause on that one. When you look at your booklet and you look at the table, we have a section that explains the PUD. If we leave that blank, it just means when you look at the materials, it doesn't say you can get an exception through a PUD. It may be that in the PUD standards, if it states that there's deviations that could be made, it could occur. We're just simply trying to be consistent on how we reported this. If in the material standards it says you can get a deviation through the PUD, we check that box. So, in the cases when you look at Coon Rapids or Apple Valley or Minnetonka, they don't spell out a way to get a deviation other than the typical process of if it's in the case of a disagreement with the staff interpretation, they can go to the Board of Appeals. If they're looking for a variance from the code, or a text amendment where you want to add that material to the code. In that case, Burnsville is easier than many other communities in that where it specifically addresses you can get a conditional use permit. That's an option that's available in Burnsville, where that's not available in about half the other cities. So you have an easier process than some. But when you look at the continuum there, Burnsville's about in the middle, maybe a little friendlier as far as the approval process goes. So my next step is to go through the three kind of generalized categories: the commercial zones, the industrial zones, and the multifamily zones. As I stated, if you looked at the specific language, such as Egan, they get into individual zones within their commercial or within their industrial. But as I'm sure you could appreciate with the book you were provided, we're trying to come to some summary. The last section of the book is actually special districts. So in your case, that's would be included in the heart of the city. Many other cities have special districts. That's included in your book, but we're not going to review that through a summary table. Every city does those differently. But if I could explain the table before we get really to getting into is Burnsville similar or an outlier to your other communities, I'm going to actually start on the far end on the right-hand side. That column is trying to explain how Burnsville treats that material. So if it's R or A, it's required or allowed. If it's L, it means that it's limited, meaning in most cases it can't be the majority of the building. That may be allowed for some accents, but not as the primary material. P would be that you specifically stated that it's prohibited. As was discussed earlier, when you review an ordinance, if it's not listed, you could also interpret that it's prohibited. When we put a P here, it's the code specifically says, such as the case of the, I'm sorry, you just mentioned it, but the wall graphics, you're specifically saying it's prohibited. So that's a P, or we have none, which is it's not mentioned. Often that could be treated the same, but we wanted to call that out differently. The second column from the right is the number of communities that do not mention this material. So we just wanted to call that out differently. In many cases, if you do not mention the material, that means it's prohibited, but that's slightly different than the third column where communities specifically state that it's prohibited. So then, working back, the fourth from the right is the amount of communities that allow material, but in a limited fashion. It's not allowed for the primary or all of the building exterior, but may be allowed for accents. And then the number of communities that it's required or an option. Why I'm calling this out is basically you need to, when you look at how Burnsville compares, you take the first two numbers and kind of add them together. That, such as a case of brick, 10 of the communities address brick, and they say it's allowed. In the case of in the case of Minnetonka, they don't have any list of material requirements. So you just can't assume if you don't list it, it's not allowed. You would never have a building in Minnetonka because they don't list building materials. So looking at brick, essentially 10 communities address brick, and you're with all of them. It's a required material or an allowed material. So in all the communities that we reviewed that list materials, brick could be the entirety of the building. If you look at stone, it's the same way. You look at glass, it's the same way. But under glass, there are some communities, 2 of them, that talk about transparent glass is allowed. One community addresses spandrel glass, that's allowed. And then the other 7 are undescribed. So that's kind of the comparison. You're in with the majority of cities that you just address glass. You don't go more specific about a certain amount of transparency or a certain amount of allowing spandrel glass. When we talk about stucco, you're allowing it, that's the majority of them in 7 communities. But there are 5 communities that don't mention it. Because in the tables, there's 2 communities that really don't have any requirements. I would take that as there are 7 communities that allow stucco, and there are 3 communities that prohibit it. Because they are listing, those 3 communities are listing materials that you can use. I would assume then, if those communities are not listing a material, it is therefore prohibited. So you're with the majority that stucco is allowed. You're actually in the minority on fiber cement. You are the only community that does not have a limitation on its use. 3 of the communities allow fiber cement, but in a limited fashion. So you're actually in the minority, but you can look at that you are the one allowing it. You're more friendly than your comparison cities that you allow that material. Architectural concrete, again, you're in the majority with 7. I will state that's a little different than stucco, where it was either addressed or not. There are a number of 2 communities that allow it, but only in a limited fashion. Again, this is commercial. I'm not going to go into much detail in the next 2 categories, but you would notice that in industrial, architectural concrete is allowed more, that industrial buildings are constructed a different way and have a different level of expectation. So regarding metal, there is no community that just says metal straight out. There's no community that allows metal straight out as an unlimited allowed material. There is one community that allows sheet metal, corrugated iron, or unfinished as a limited material, and then you're in with the other 6 communities that say sheet, corrugated iron, or unfinished is prohibited. So half, or even if you look at it, that some communities don't really address material, more than half the communities state that that type of metal is prohibited altogether, and you're in that group. Becoming more popular is the panel systems, and that metal may be used in that panel system. There are 5 communities that allow that without restriction. You're actually in the next category that you allow it, but in a limited format. And then there are a couple communities that talk about pre-finished or natural weathered. You're in the category that doesn't address that. And then there are 4 communities that talk about metal either without any additional specifications or as an accent. All those communities use it as a limited material, and you're included in that category. Vinyl was only addressed once. You're not that community. Wood is similar to the metal that about half the communities mention it. Most of them use it in a limited fashion, not as a primary material. You also have that. And then there's a number of materials that were specifically called out that Burnsville does not apply. That is copper, ephes, or ceramics. I will point out that in many cases, ephes and stucco are used interchangeably. But again, we're trying to point out, we're taking it verbatim from the code. So there are 5 communities that use the term ephes instead of stucco. So you guys may allow ephes because you count it as the same definition, but we're just clearly taking it verbatim. We're not trying to add too much interpretation beyond what they have listed. And then finally, concrete, and does it address painted brick and panelized system separate from metal? Concrete unfinished, 2 of the communities allow it as a limited fashion, 4 of the communities prohibit specifically, and you fall in the category of it's specifically prohibited. Painted brick is prohibited in 3 communities. You're one of them. But in both those, particularly in the painted brick, no community specifically says it's just outright allowed. So while the majority of cities do not address it at all, you can take that as being prohibited, even though it wasn't specifically called out. So I wouldn't say that I'd say you're in the majority, even though you specifically call it out. Most of the communities find that prohibited. And then the panelized system, most of the communities that talk about that allow it in a limited manner, and you're in the majority there. Now, next I am going to go over industrial and multifamily. I will not go through it in as much detail, but before I do, I just want to ask, this is a complicated table. Does it make sense how we applied that? And is it understandable where Burnsville falls in these categories?
Commissioners?
Yes.
I think, for me, it makes sense. So it shows where we are in the spectrum from one end to the next. We are almost in the middle, and I think, actually, it's a good place to be, really.
Right.
It's a safe place to be, so.
Sounds good.
So we can continue.
And I thought, like, say for instance, though metal seems to be the most controversial, if you just take this as a spot graph, there's more in the middle than, anything clear at one end or the other. But no, I appreciate how you put this together.
Mr. Chair, I got a question.
Commissioner Singh.
I have a question, and
Yes.
this is one regarding painted brick or painted concrete. 9 communities with no mention of this material, and from what I'm hearing is that they're prohibited. If it's not mentioned, most likely they're prohibited.
I think it's in the middle, because if you look at the very top, there are 10 communities that allow brick.
Yep.
2 that don't mention it at all. So when 3 communities say you can't paint brick, even if we assume, if it's 3 of those 10, there's 7 communities that don't address it at all. So I would almost take that as 7 communities don't regulate it. They allow brick, and they don't talk about how you finish it.
That clarifies my concern, because I thought that brick mean painted brick is expected in a commercial building,
I would take this that 7 communities would allow
Okay, thank you.
brick to be painted.
Thank you.
Except in Burnsville.
Well, you're not on your own. 2 other communities specifically said you can't paint brick. If we looked at the top column, the 2 communities that don't mention brick at all are the 2 communities that have very little to nothing in their ordinance. So I wouldn't add those definitely to ones that prohibit it. So if we're looking at 12,
That being Richfield and Minnetonka.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you look at the 12, you would say you're in with 1/3 of that group.
Thank you.
Yep. So industrial materials, you'll see it's pretty similar with the exception of that second to last column. There are more communities that have no mention of these materials. There's a couple more communities that don't have specifics about industrial buildings. They may care a lot about commercial buildings, but don't have as much concern about industrial. But if you looked at kind of the left three, you see it's in a pretty similar fashion. Brick and stone is allowed by the majority of them. As you get down to more of the concrete and the metal, it gets more into a limited fashion or not mentioned at all. So it's pretty similar to the commercial. It's a lot of times if you looked at the specifics, when it's limited, the percentage might be higher than the commercial. You'd find a lot of times in the commercial, it may be limited to no more than 25%, where in industrial, it may be limited to 50%. So they're still limited, but often in the industrial, it's a larger percentage. And then finally, for multifamily, it's a fairly similar pattern as well. There's not 10 communities that are calling out for materials anymore. It's only 8. So the same 2 communities that care a lot about the commercial but care less about the industrial is the same for the multifamily. But you will see, the way we ranked it basically on the commercial side, that the most communities that allow the material, it's the same pattern. That the ones at the top, the brick and stone, is still the highest materials listed in all the ordinances. You will note, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to industrial. When we look at Burnsville, the nuns come along more often than in the commercial. And then when you go to Burnsville, the nuns are more common here too. So, you end up being one of the communities that you're not as specific in the multifamily or the industrial as in the commercial. Now, I think that might be, a question I'd like to hear from staff, but I don't know that just because it lists as none, is that specific that Burnsville then prohibits it. But it's more when you look at this axis where we talk about on the right, you're the least specific, and on the left, you're the most specific. Basically, Burnsville is the most specific for commercial, and then less specific for industrial, and then even less specific for multifamily. So we listed those 3 out to kind of see if we could find any patterns. And I think the pattern we find is, the same materials that are attractive, the brick, stone, and glass, show up to be the most attractive in all 3 categories. But that communities get less specific about building materials once you move into the industrial or multifamily categories.
Let's have staff answer your
Sure.
question. So if it's not called out, so if we specifically haven't prohibited it, how is that typically handled in the city?
We have, what we do in your reports, and with the architectural review tool, is we identify that. We identify, for instance, if you can have 10%, up to 10% metal on a building. If they exceed that, we'll let you know, and it's usually either a PUD or a CUP to allow the difference in the materials. I think that most, because we have so much more commercial than we have multifamily or industrial, that's where the focus is.
Where we spent the time.
And that's also the, you know, the areas that are most visible in the community are the commercial. And really, for the multifamily residential, they're almost all brick. I mean, the apartments.
They were built in
and
the
whatever.
80s.
Yep, exactly, almost all brick.
Well, the only one I'd point out that I'm going to assume is a little different is you have a glass specifically called out in commercial and industrial, but glass isn't specifically called out in the multifamily. I think everybody assumes you're not going to have a unit without a window. So I think, that doesn't mean it's prohibited. It's just,
Right.
you expect it.
Obviously,
and then-
yeah, it's allowed per building code and, yeah,
Right.
we don't prohibit it, correct.
Thank you.
So, before I move on to the next piece, I'll see if there's any other questions, because this is the horizontal axis part of the discussion. The next part of the discussion is the vertical axis. So if you have any questions about the book or the summaries that came out of that book, I think this might be an appropriate time. But I will caveat that with, the very last slide is going to be asking you, do you have any recommendations on any changes to the materials? And then the second question would be, do you have any recommendations on approval process? So you will have another opportunity to provide input if you choose not to at the time. But I wanted to pause before we move on to see if you have any other questions about the material requirements and how Burnsville compares to your comparable cities.
First of all, I appreciate all the work. I know there's a tremendous amount, and I knew we were in trouble when we got the email, said this was gonna be hand-delivered to our house. I've been a bit of a champion on this all along, and you had addressed we have the background information of some PUDs that we had to do, and one of the things I guess that I would continue to ask for as we move forward, I don't mean to jump ahead a bit, but as the community is aged and as we have to be open to redevelopment, I would like to see the community move up and to the right. As you asked questions in reference in the past, and as to, I'd by less detailed, if it's allowed, and more administrative pieces, which I know we can get to. I realize in many cases, our ordinance may not simply be just adding materials. We may have to go back and look at to what Ms. Garros mentioned was the percentages. Because my goal, along with, other people's goals, but from a personal goal, is to how we ease this process from our commercial applicants, and how can the staff handle this administratively, and also make sure that we are not putting ourselves in a bad comparative to our neighboring communities. You had mentioned that you, in our background, and I don't know if you're gonna cover talking about like panelized steel, where you went to the car dealerships, the BMW dealership, and you had mentioned that had partially deteriorated. The Honda dealership is brand new, the Mitsubishi dealership's brand new, all of those multi-stories are brand new, but I would assume in Richfield, given where they're at on the continuum, that those applicants did or did not have to do a PUD because of that material, but we probably don't know that, do we?
Yeah, we didn't go that far. We went to, if they, what guidance is the ordinance giving them? In Richfield, are you saying that it's allowed? Well, in Richfield, they have very limited language about material at all. My guess, because of the height, because of the lot coverage, they probably were required to do a PUD for other reasons,
Yeah.
and may have addressed that material. But to your point, at the end, like my staff report, I have the auto dealerships, and I have, the Edina, Richfield, Target kind of example. So we are going to talk about those specifically apart from these tables. So
Okay.
the auto dealerships we will address specifically. Yes.
Eric, for the communities, the couple of communities that don't have any materials listed, what do they do, or how do they? And then
Yeah.
could you also just identify for the commissioners the difference between the statutory Plan B
Yes.
cities and what we are? I think that would help.
Yes. I will go to the next slide, even though I'm not going to call it out. If you look at the heading, the ones in blue are statutory cities,
And
which you are one
we're
of them.
statutory.
Yeah. The ones in kind of that brownish orange are charter cities. So it's about half and half. But such as administrative approval by the city manager, you only have a city manager in a charter city. It is common that charter cities give their manager, which they view more as an executive branch, more powers than what a statutory city has the ability to. So if they choose to have a city charter that includes building materials or design review process, it is likely they have powers that a statutory city does not. So we did try to call that out. I'm sorry, Deb, what was your first question?
And the other one, for the communities that really don't list
Sure.
any materials, how do they?
Sure. So
does that work?
we talked with Richfield and Burnsville. In Richfield's case, they have a number of overlay districts or special districts. And, like Richfield has, really it's 66th Street. It's along Cedar Avenue, Highway 77, along 494. They have either overlays or special districts, and that's how they regulate. If it's somewhere other than that, then it's kind of what you wanted, what the applicant wants to do. So their overall ordinance is not very specific at all. But if you choose a particular neighborhood, you could have some very specific regulations. If you think of Richfield, that's the majority of the commercial neighborhoods. Now, there's some others, there's some commercial, if you go through, kind of some of your north-south streets, your Penns or Lindale, Nicollet, when you get away from 494 and when you get away from 66, there is some scattered commercial. Those are the ones that they say, those are kind of old, not necessarily historic, they're probably almost non-conforming. So just not having specifics about them, you're almost grandfathering them in. They concentrate on the overlay districts or the corridors, which can be very specific. And if you wanted to know details about those, that's included in the last tab of special districts.
Just wanted the commissioners to
Yeah.
kind of understand that.
In the case of Minnetonka, they pretty much said, we encourage everything that's commercial to be through a PUD and we'll deal with it in the individual PUD. They just choose to do it that way. Their ordinance and their process is set up that, we are getting to this table. There's really very little ability to get any administrative approval. So they'll take it, but they view to take it on as an individual basis.
And for this other form of government, like Minnetonka,
Yep.
Richfields, and whatever, what you don't realize is that in order to change their ordinance, they need a referendum
Yeah.
of all of the citizens. So it's a big difference. The way we do things may seem difficult here, but if we had to do a referendum for materials or most of the work we do, so there's a big difference in the type of city, the city you're at. And I think the information that Eric and WSB put together really kind of lends itself to that. Thank you, Eric.
No
Appreciate
problem. I think it's a good transition to this next table. So we talked about, what the top means. We tried to with the understanding of trying to make a spectrum, we listed what we feel is kind of the least restrictive to the most restrictive, but it's not black and white, so I want to go over that a little bit. Administrative approval should be pretty black and white. If at a staff level they can approve it, that's the least restrictive. When we're talking about planning commission or city council action, that specifically says in their code, you know, they list the materials and then the last material is or is approved by the planning commission or city council. So it's not a variance process. It's, you know, you're not going to the Board of Appeals. It's when the application becomes before you, you make a call. And yeah, maybe this time we'll use that material. Conditional use permit and PUD, there's two things to talk about them. First of all, conditional use permit, if it's not listed as a conditional use permit, you can't use the conditional use permit process. Where the PUD, if it has an X, it specifically says in their code, they can get a deviation through the PUD. It is likely that the majority of the cities that are blank could also get it through a PUD, but they didn't specifically talk about it in the ordinance. But here, if in the conditional use permit it's blank, that's not an option in those cities. You need to find another process for a deviation. We also, usually with the plan unit development, you're doing a PUD agreement or a development agreement, and that's an extra step beyond just a conditional use permit. So we looked at if you could do it by conditional use, it's an easier process. While it still may be a public hearing and you still may go to the planning commission or the city council, just administratively and implementing in the future, it's a lot easier. You're not getting into the question of, is it a PUD amendment? If it's a conditional use permit, it's much clearer. Then variance and text amendment, that's allowed everywhere because that's the process to get a deviation. If you want something different than the code, you could request a variance. If you want it added to your zoning district, you could request that. I'm not going to go over it, but the other table that came with this is what is the approval process? The variance is the one that has a lot of differences. Some, because in most communities, it really reads the Board of Appeals and Adjustments can grant a variance, but often it's communities will say the Planning Commission is the Board of Appeals, or in other communities, they'll say the City Council is the Board of Appeals. So you'll look, there's some communities that there's an X under Planning Commission, and some communities there's an X under the City Council, some there's an X in both. That's all based on what the city's Board of Appeals rules are. But those are the two options. And then finally, the last two are options for deviations, but it's not a part of the continuum. The Board of Appeals and Adjustments, as we listed it here, which all communities have, this is interpreting what the code says. So it's not an argument of, your code says brick and somebody's coming in with, it's easier to interpret brick, but it might be if your code is silent on spandrel glass and, staff says, no, we don't say it, so you can't do it. Well, you could go to the Board of Appeals and get an interpretation. When you don't say spandrel glass, does that really mean it's allowed? Because you just generally say glass. So Board of Appeals and Adjustments is a deviation process, but it's kind of outside. It's interpreting the existing code. It's not allowing a material that otherwise would be prohibited. And then in the case of two charter cities, they have overlay districts in which they give staff more authority on. So that's kind of a minority, but that's not part of the spectrum. The spectrum of the vertical graph is really, if you allow administrative approval, that's the easiest process. And if you have to get a text amendment, that's the hardest process. And why we determined that Burnsville was a little above that graph is the conditional use permit. The communities that allow an administrative authority, The majority of them are charter cities. Richfield is the one exception. They're similar to you. But then a couple cities don't grant administrative approval, but allow the planning commission or city council to make the determination outside of a variance. So it's, the reason why that's different than, say, a variance is a separate process. Here, just simply through your review, you could allow that. That's Coon Rapids and Egan. So those two, Burnsville does not choose to employ. You do have the conditional use permit process, which puts you in line with Lakeville and Plymouth. But Plymouth is kind of an anomaly because they also have administrative approval. So it's kind of a choice of, their staff of, I'm not comfortable with approving that material, but you could go to through the conditional use permit process and try that and see what the planning commission or city council says. Again, while plan unit development isn't completely filled, every community has a PUD process. Most communities use it. That's an option to all communities, as is a variance and a text amendment. So when we go back here, the Coon Rapids, Apple Valley, Minnetonka, there's no other option. When we look at Edina and St. Louis Park, there may be some exceptions for some areas that or they allow more, are more friendly to the limitations. But when we're looking below the graph, that is communities that choose not to employ either administrative or just simply the city council or a CUP. So you're friendlier than most. Again, and I think to Ms. Garros's point, when you start looking at communities that are in that allowing the city council or the administrative authority, the majority of them are charter cities. Most statutory cities choose not to have that. But it also goes back to the Egan. They allow their planning commission or city council to grant additional materials, but this is commentary. If you look at their ordinance, I don't know what materials left to address. That is so specific about materials, where it should be, what percentages. I think it would be hard to find a material that's not on their list that they don't already address. So while they're friendlier to the developer on what process they have to go through is the deviation, you could almost look at it as the developer doesn't have much choice. There's a box. There's a very descriptive box. Within that box, it's an easy process, but you're dealing with very specific requirements. So I'm just venturing to guess, but that's probably was their choice. We'll give a lot of direction by being specific about what's allowed to interpret of, okay, if you are requesting a variation, you really need to describe why the work that was spent to come up with these rules, you're different than that. So that's why we thought the continuum of, it's not just simply, is it easy for the applicant to go through the process? It's also how much flexibility does the design professional that you're working with really have to design a building for your use and your style. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So the two specifics that areas that was called out at our last meeting is the automotive sales. So we have the Bloomington example on the left and the Honda example on the right. I use this picture on the left because this is essentially the back of the entrance to what is essentially the parking garage. So the first floor is concrete with this pattern. And then if you were to look at the opposite side, which is the entrance to that garage, it's all concrete there. But the vast majority of the building is sheet metal. Then you see Actually, in the case of the picture of the car, that would be an example of spandrel glass. It's glass, but you can't see through it. And then louvers, which make a lot of sense when you have essentially a parking garage. You need to have that ventilation for the cars to open up. When I went out and took a look, it's really the corners that were cracking, but it's not a very old building, so that was a little surprising. I think it might be because of the material they chose. I don't know exactly what it is other than it's not steel, because it's been cracked, but it's not corroding. So I only bring that up to compare it to your continuum. I think it's either the choice of the builder choosing the right materials or the owner keeping up with the maintenance. There's issues that may arise that have nothing to do with the quality of the material. You know, it could be they chose the wrong material, or I think in this case, if it's aluminum or zinc or something, making a 90-degree bend with that material is that material is just not used to that. Where if they chose a different material, it might be just fine. In the case of the Richfield, the majority of the building, the shell of the building, is almost more industrial. It's basically a tip-up concrete panel. And then here on the south side, which you could almost argue is more about making a picture frame. You know, the majority of this is really windows to put cars in for display, and the blue is the accent. And then on the opposite side is the side that, you know, customers come in and out of. Their entry has an entry feature of this same blue material. So both of these dealerships use metal, but if you look at Burnsville, it's at least 75% metal, if not more. If you look at Richfield and you took out the glass, you might be closer to 25% metal. So these are examples of two automobile dealerships that use metal, and in both cases, it's the material that probably visually is the most apparent, but in the case of Bloomington, it's the majority metal. In the case of Richfield, I think it's more the color scheme that they chose. You know, that it's probably only about 25% metal, but when you have a cream or white background and you put the sharp blue on it, it really catches your eye. But it's not that the building is majority metal, even though people may think of that just because that's the snap. So I wanted to point those two things out because we will get into it as well with the Richfield and Edina examples of their targets. The majority of communities just simply list materials: stone, brick. The minority of communities are the ones that get into, you know, the more specific spandrel glass or, the different types of metal. I don't think you're going to guarantee a quality building by getting more specific. If it's metal, it's working with the applicant and the builder, as well as I find it hard to believe that Bloomington, BMW intentionally wanted panels that are cracking 5 years later. You know, that happened, but I find it hard to believe they're choosing a building material that has a very limited lifespan. I think it's more of a question of, do you allow metal or not, less than is it a high quality material. Sometimes it's just, I think we can all acknowledge it's a newer material being used. It might be going through some growing pains of the manufacturers. And then in the case of Bloomington, with their sharp corners and their curves, they're really kind of testing the architecture, where Richfield's more of a traditional box. So some of these materials may be much more suitable. But to that conclusion, I don't encourage you to try to get that specific and try to outthink it, of if you're going to use it on a 90-degree corner, it needs to be this material. You're going to have to address it a little bit with the architecture and somewhat trust that if a company's making an investment and hiring design professionals, they're not intending to have to replace their material in short order. So regarding other metal exterior examples, these were specifically shown at the work session of the City Council during the previous issue with metal siding. The one on the left is Richfield, that's the Cedar Point Commons. The one on the right is Edina, just south of the Galleria. In both these cases, they're probably using in the neighborhood of 25% metal on their exterior. And if you looked at it, that's corrugated metal. I don't know how else you're gonna describe that. It's corrugated with a wider corrugation than what we may think of the old farm pole buildings, but that's corrugated at about a 12-inch corrugation. I don't know how else you would actually describe those materials. And then, not many, I've seen other communities that get real specific about fasteners and the like, and I think some of that is the thought that, where there's holes and where there's exposed surfaces, that those are more likely to degrade or corrode. Well, on the right is the Chipotle at the Cedar Point Commons in that same target development. I did a detail there on the left, the zinc-coated piping that is their accent is just attached with bolts and plates, and then you can probably see in between in the corrugated there, it just screws through the exterior of the corrugation. That's probably about 15 years old, and there are no obvious signs of corrosion or issues. I think that's because if it's designed specifically for that, you're going to get that. What you find a lot of times is if a material, I'd guess that those materials probably, in the case of the corrugated metal, came pre-finished, but with the holes in them. It's often where on the site if there's an exterior material that's trying to prevent corrosion, if you're drilling through it and removing it, that's an area. We're not seeing that here. And in the case of the simple zinc-coated, zinc takes care of that. We're not seeing that corrosion. I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, but I do have it in one of your attachments. At the Target, they had this walkway. Let's see if I can get back to it.
It was in our background, where the
Yeah.
paint had peeled.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did see that.
But at the same time, this concrete feature, the paint's peeling there too. So it's not only the material. I don't know whether it's the way it was constructed or its age, but you can find examples of materials that are permitted that need repairs or are not properly maintained, and then you can find examples of metal in that case that wasn't properly maintained. I think the big difference was here they're using galvanized metal, which has that zinc coating. Mm-hmm. In the case of the walkway that I showed, that was just simply steel that was painted. The paint was chipping off, it was starting to rust. If they would have used a different steel, they probably wouldn't have that same condition. But as we talked about before, most communities are not getting that specific in their ordinance of only galvanized steels allowed. Actually, you have some communities that were discouraging of that. But I just wanted to give those examples to unfortunately say the news of, I think it's more in how good your design professionals are, and if they're choosing the right materials for the job, than necessarily the city trying to outthink that and write, very prescriptive codes to get an attractive building. That being said, aesthetics is something that the city has has the ability to control. Different communities, choose materials that they think makes a character in the city. I know because I do some work there in Wayzata, they love cedar on residential buildings. But if you want to choose a material that is ill-suited, it's that case, but that's what they want. I think everybody's thinking of cedar when you're thinking of the salt-washed, wind-washed Cape Cod. And when you bring that to Minnesota, where it's long winters,
Woodpeckers.
humid, woodpeckers, moss, you don't get that same appearance. But Wayzata chooses that's the material they want to have. So you have competing issues of, are you trying to regulate a community to have high quality materials so you don't, if buildings aren't maintained, you don't have an eyesore. That's one issue compared to, are you trying to regulate the city's aesthetic to have a common vision or a common theme? I'm looking at it more here as the material. Is there materials that do not hold up well in Minnesota that most of the communities are not choosing to use? All cities have the choice of kind of adopting a common theme for their communities. Most of those communities are smaller geographically, have a long history that they want to contain. Not normally a city the size of Burnsville that's adopting a common architectural theme throughout the city. So again, we get back to the two questions. One, are there any amendments to the types of materials that the Planning Commission would like to see? But that is separate from, are there any amendments that you'd like to see to the approval process? So I hope those are two questions that you could speak to, but if you could please provide us directions separately for those 2 points. Maybe I will before you start. The intention of the process is that we take your feedback. I work with staff to try to basically come up with a red line ordinance that you would review at your next meeting, but we would not set the public hearing for the next meeting. You would have the opportunity to review the red lines, the changes, before we would schedule a public hearing for, at the quickest, 2 meetings from now.
Commissioners, questions? I'll start with you, Commissioner Workman.
What were our goals, if there was any clarification going into this process as a, staff, city council or planning commission? What were we trying to achieve here with this study? What's the why?
All I could address is the specific city council work session. And specifically that there were pictures brought that showed other communities, comparable communities, had allowed more metal than what Burnsville's ordinance does. That's all I am specifically aware of. If Ms. Dean or Ms. Garros are recalling any other previous conversations, that would be appreciated.
I think just in general, the past year, there's been a lot of discussion about, Burnsville's ordinance and are we too restrictive or not? Or, why do we have to go through this process for these materials and not those? So I think the idea is here, Eric and WSB has tried to go through and see what other communities do to give you some comparison and also what different processes are out there and provide you that information. And we're looking for what you want to do. Is we would rather have those things addressed and dealt with rather than question every time a particular application comes in for a development project.
it seemed that we're right in the middle, kind of where you want to be, where we're give a little, but hold the line to a certain extent. I know that metal was a type of material that's come up, and maybe we want to address that specifically in this direction. Since we already talked about painted brick tonight, we could maybe move over to metal for murals. That was supposed to be a joke, but I guess I thought that was funny, and we're getting late. So I don't know. I would turn it over to Commissioner Singh and Chair Bradrick for direction on.
Commissioner Singh, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Chair. At first, when I looked at this agenda item, I was a bit confused. The same question came up. What were we required to do? And going through, and I made my notes, and I think my questions were answered in your explanation of these things. What I would like to see here is that staff probably come up with some recommendations, and with your help, because you have done this thing, come up with some recommendations, and let's, as you said, let's discuss them at another meeting before the public hearing. This is the first step. I see this is very, very good information to see where we stand when you compare ourselves to our neighboring cities. We are bunched in the middle, but if our intention is to make it a more customer friendly, then I think there's room for improvement here. And if staff, you and staff can come up with some recommendations or give us some options. I would like to say, give us some options, and we can discuss it at the next meeting. The information tonight was very helpful for me, but it's also overwhelming.
Can I ask a question? Are you specifically wanting us to address commercial, industrial, and the multifamily residential when we come back with different options or a red line ordinance, or do you want us to focus on one specific district only, and you're comfortable with how we approach 2 of the 3, or?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Dean, for me, this is a lot of information, and I think we are in good shape. We are not way out there for our customers, developers. We can handle, in my opinion, we can handle all, because I don't see many changes happening in each area. Minor change, because we are okay. I can see minor changes to improve make it more customer friendly.
Commissioner Singh, I think you just answered what was going to be my question, but the direction you're looking for us to move is being more customer friendly. You're not asking us to be more restrictive on any particular piece of material.
I don't see any area will be more restrictive. I mean, with the metal, in my opinion, that's one of my areas we can talk about when you bring it back to us, is that 25% or 50%, or a range.
Okay, that's helpful.
Anything else?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I would agree, and I do appreciate the education on the difference between a statutory and a charter city. And what I was hoping for, once again, I'm not looking for more restrictive, but as we look at our past history, I think even though we're a statutory city, if our ordinance requires no more than 15% of something, and if we could bump that to 25 or 30, and then it could be administratively handled, where someone doesn't have to come into us. I am, continually reminded that we are a city of planned unit developments.
Yep.
And,
Yes, we are.
and as we talk about, while I've been on the planning commission, I think we've done Honda, and Nissan was before me, but we did Walzer, and then the Toyota dealership, and I guess one of the things, let me back up, before I talk about that, like the Semstone application, that was simply, a minor change, and it was concrete, and it was a building, and you're telling me that probably because we're a statutory city, we could never allow an administrative decision for an applicant like that it's in an industrial district, and this is a temporary building, and this is what it's gonna be, so we're going to allow it. That's not something we'd ever be able to get to, probably.
No, I don't think that's the case, but you have to have your ordinance developed so that staff knows what direction you want.
To do.
And also that needs to also correspond to your overall comprehensive plan. In the past, up until this year, it seems, with the change in council, there has been a lot of emphasis on what buildings look like. We have studied exterior materials, especially commercial and industrial. I know we did a huge study in moratorium in 2008. We did other studies in, I think, 2011, smaller. And then we also, amend the ordinance, yearly for different things. So it really, I think what we're looking for is from Planning Commission standpoint, what would you like us to allow? And if we write the ordinance such that, you're okay with 50% or 75% or 100%, of whatever materials, we can do that. What staff does not want to do is, because in the past, as I say, it was a big deal when the funeral home painted their brick white. That was a big deal, and a lot of people were upset, council members, whatever. And as a staff person, we need to have guidance so that we know what you want to do and that we're operating based on what planning commission and council want to see. So we need enough, for guidance rather than just like, it's okay. Because we found in the past that
It was not.
staff does not want to be hung out to dry when.
And that would never be my goal, so I
Yeah.
think I've been around long enough I think I appreciate that.
But you can.
If I
have the
could, before you
ordinance.
change subjects,
Like.
I think what Ms. Garros was trying to get at earlier is that charter cities have more ability to put things in charters than statutory cities have. But it comes with a flip side of the coin. To change a charter, you have to get the majority of your citizens to say that. So if you have a charter that says this, the city manager has the authority to make these decisions, the majority of your residents have spoken to say that. Where a statutory city, it's, yourself providing guidance to the city council. That's all it takes to get an ordinance change. So the charter cities who chose to give administrative authority chose as a community to be more customer friendly. But there's other charter cities who've chosen to be more difficult, and that's not going to change unless the majority of your residents voted for it. So yeah, I don't, in the case of Richfield, they're a statutory city that chose to give some of their staff some ability. There's no reason why you can't. It's, I would hate to see what happened with the funeral home. You get an important issue out there and get it rolling, you could have had 50% of the residents saying, that's it, we're gonna be restrictive, and you kind of get stuck. So it's just a different process. The other part of it is, as I mentioned, a lot of times those communities look at the city manager as the executive branch, that they have the powers that the people gave them, and so they have kind of inherently expected to have more flexibility or more, make more interpretations, not always go to the council for direction. It's whatever flexibility the charter set out. So it's the anomaly that and I think it's probably for the reason that Ms. Garros pointed out, it's the anomaly that statutory cities give the administrative ability to staff, because you need to give very clear direction.
And I'd like to clarify, I'm not, to Ms. Garros's point, I'm not looking to kind of hang the I want to be able to make slight changes to our ordinances so it can be administratively handled, and they have the guidance. They know exactly what the deviations could be. And if an application in the city of Burnsville would require a PUD or a CUP because we restrict an ordinance to 15%, but if they went across the border to another city and at that application, they allow 30%, and they came in at 30, and administratively, it could have been handled.
Yeah.
And that application, we're, at that point, we are no longer we're not competitive.
Yeah.
And so I hope I'm explaining it well. I'm not looking to change our how we do that. I'm looking to what needs to be changed in our ordinances to give them that flexibility to, if it's, when does it trigger a CUP and when does it trigger a PUD? Because the time that I've been on the planning commission, it seems like people have to go through one of those processes. For in many cases, it's allowed in other communities, and maybe it's because it's allowed in another community and it's allowed at a greater percentage, and we have a more restricted percentage. So that would be my guidance. And then I guess the best example I have, and there's probably some differences here in timing, but when we tore down our super target and we built, it was a Target Greatland, and we built a super target. The building had not been open that long compared to when this one was built in Cedar Point. Not a dramatic difference. And, if you look at the architectural differences between ours and theirs, Richfield got a much more distinct look. They got a little more steel, they got a little more whatever. And the building is much more, it's got a lot more architecture to it than what we did. Now, maybe they chose to do that, and then that's fine, but I would just want to be in a situation where we did not force that. And the final example would be our Honda dealership is not dramatically older than the Honda dealership in Richfield, Bloomington. Essentially, it's the same product. It's white steel and blue. And as a city, I'm, I guess, kind of interested in what did we make Walser Honda, what hurdles did they have to go through to build it? Or could there have been tweaks in our code that allowed that product and staff knew exactly what they could do? And I guess essentially I'm trying to put myself out of business. Less comes in front of us.
If I could jump in before you turn it over to the others, Chair. I guess I'd like your input on kind of that in-between step. The not necessarily all the way to the administrative, but the allowing the planning commission and city council, basically adding an additional material that says, or high quality material that the planning commission or city council approves. And Ms. Garros, you can weigh in if this isn't how you'd use it. That would give some flexibility to staff to provide a recommendation to you, but you're ultimately the one to say, no, staff, I think you went a little too far, or you went, you're heading in the right direction. That does provide a little bit of flexibility. I think it also, even though we have three categories, commercial, industrial, multifamily, you could break those categories further, and you do, in that you have different zones. Mm-hmm. There may be times where you have, and maybe Semstone was the one, you have an industrial building on an industrial lot that's around other industrial lots or a landfill. Well, who are you hurting letting them have unadorned concrete compared to the industrial building, farther south that's adjacent to retail, commercial, and across the street from residential? You might not want to give that same lenience. So that middle step of planning commission, city council interpretation allows you to look more at the site and the specifics, or you see it's all part of a common architectural theme that they gave, the design professional gave a lot of thought to it, and it makes sense, where another applicant that's just buying a kit, you might not give them the same flexibility, if that makes any sense. But it would allow staff to work with those design professionals to try to understand, why are you choosing this material over that material? And if they can give a good rationale, well, maybe staff would support that in their staff report. But the check is still there that the planning commission needs to recommend it and the city council needs to approve it. It's different than, because it's not necessarily a public hearing if you were already coming through with a review that doesn't require a public hearing. But it does give you a little bit, there is an in-between of going straight to administrative and what you're doing.
Commissioner Singh.
Mr. Chair, I don't think we are putting ourselves out of business. I don't know how many developers and people who want to come to the planning commission. I don't know. I mean, they come, it's like a last resort, and then we make recommendations to the city council. I think it will be most useful for everyone if we can help, if we can make recommendations so that staff will have the framework for working with the applicants, the developers, and make it user-friendly. That's what I'm asking for, that you bring back some stuff so we can look at those. We have, right now, we have 25%. We're going to talk with staff. Staff, you've been dealing with these people. What have they been asking for? If we put a limit of 25% and they've been asking for 35%, and there's no problem, and we can give them that, and we'll maintain the quality and the aesthetics that we need, then why don't we do that? And make it easier for staff to work with these people, and for the people to get the satisfaction they want by dealing with staff. They don't have to come to us. They will, I shouldn't say they don't have to. You will always get requests, deviations that they will have to come to us. But those are the extreme cases. And that's what I'm looking for, that we can make these recommendations to City Council, that staff can work closer with these people. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Singh. Commissioner Workman, your final comments.
Mr. Chair, I tend to agree with Commissioner Singh in that I'm sure developers would rather take care of a lot of these things administratively and save the escrow and the process that it takes to come before us. And so if we can make development easier in the city by way of staff and administrative processes, I would be in full agreement with that. To a certain extent, I don't want to put the full burden on staff.
No.
But to make their job easier, I would want to know what you guys think too. And we can switch seats and then you guys can tell us what you guys think.
I can say, if we have parameters and we know what's acceptable by planning commission, council, the community at large, that helps us do our jobs. When we have to bring something in front of planning commission and council, there's a lot of time, analysis, staff report writing, background, gathering information. That does take, a lot of time compared to us reviewing something administratively, check the boxes, meets code, meets our architectural handout that we provide, looks great, building permit issued within a week or two. So.
Sure, I think we're all on the same page right now.
I think we have consensus.
Yep.
Does that help?
I guess I'm going to just press you one last time to see, moving from conditional use permit to a deviation that just is approved by the city council through the normal process. Are you interested in making that move?
That was never, that wasn't my goal.
No.
Okay.
My goal was to take just exactly what Commissioner Singh said.
Okay.
How can we, where have we been too restrictive?
Okay.
And how can we give staff the ability to approve it, and then the outliers
Extreme.
have to come to us?
That's
And
helpful
then
direction.
we can hit more of the middle and make the application process an easier process.
Okay.
Anything else?
Don't.
Okay. This isn't a public hearing, so I didn't forget to do that this evening. That brings us to our last item, which is updates. Commissioners, do you have any updates?
I think we should bring one of these weeks.
One of these? On
I've
my,
been doing this for almost 2 years and nobody's ever had an update.
oh, sometimes Commissioner Singh does.
Yeah,
No updates.
no updates
No
tonight.
updates? Staff?
Do you want to?
Go right ahead.
So we have just a couple of upcoming meetings. June 19th is the Comp Plan Advisory Committee meeting, focus on park and natural resources. The June 21st, there's a meeting, and it's a work session for Planning Commission training. So that's upcoming. You'll have already heard about that, and you'll receive an update about that as well. And then our next tentatively scheduled Planning Commission meeting is June 26th. Currently, we have one item. Deb will pass out the agenda. Tentatively planned is Buck Hill for an amendment to their plan unit development.
Okay.
The work session also will be much different than what we've done in the past. Kind of looking at some of the issues that we've faced, changes in terms of, legislation and the scrutiny that we're held to for various projects and things. And I think it will be a much more interesting type of session, interactive, than what you're used to in the past. It's going to be a lot different, so hopefully for the good. And the only other thing I have is some planning magazines for those of you that are here, Vince and Ram.
Is Steve gonna have to recuse himself then?
That's it.
Commissioners, I would stand for a motion for adjournment.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Workman, second by Commissioner Singh. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. Thank you for attending and have a safe drive home, and thanks for everyone watching.
Thank you.